Hello, and welcome to the ESCoE Economic Measurement Seminar on measuring the value of free digital goods, presented by John Poquiz. I am Leonard Nakamura of the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia. The usual disclaimer applies. These are my opinions and not those of the Federal Reserve. Today, we're honored to have John Lourenze Poquiz at King's College London and also of ESCoE presenting. The discussant will be Carmit Schwartz of the UNSW Sydney, who will please put any questions you might have in using the Q&A function, and I must tell you that this session is being recorded. Anyway, John, the floor is yours.
Hi, thank you, Leonard. Thank you for first of all, thank you for ESCoE for inviting me to present my paper in the ESCoE webinar, and thank you for everyone who took the time to attend the webinar. So for this, for this session, I'm going to be talking about my paper, which is about measuring the value of free digital goods. The way I'm characterizing digital goods in this paper is I'm using the terms goods and services and maybe products interchangeably. So when we're talking about free digital goods, in the context of this research at least, we're generally talking about free services that are offered online for free. So if we're thinking about video conferencing, if you're thinking about emails and online news, actually those are the goods that I'll be focusing on in this research. But yeah, one thing we can notice these days is that whenever we see that WhatsApp or when we see that WhatsApp or Gmail is down, it instantly make headlines. So even if WhatsApp is only down for 45 minutes, everyone's talking about it in Twitter. Everyone's like news outlets are starting to write about it. This speaks of how these services are impacting people's lives already. Now, this is motivating many researchers to think about how much we actually value how much value we actually receive from these digital services. Now, there are generally two general motivations for valuing free digital services or free digital goods. First, we like to think we want to construct some sort of welfare indicator that where we can assess how much welfare or how much value as households do we receive from the free digital products. Another motivation would be the productivity puzzle. So in terms of welfare, the link between production the link between production and consumption is one of the main reasons why the national accounts is a popular indicator of welfare. It sort of assumes that whatever we produce, we consume, and assuming that that utility is increasing in consumption, an increase in production should correlate to some increase in utility. So this is why gross domestic product is sometimes used as some sort of indicator for welfare. However, recently, we're gaining a lot of utility from the consumption of services that doesn't have a market price, and generally, goods and services that don't have a market price are not generally reflected in GDP. Also for market goods and services, we can examine the relative importance of market goods and services by looking at their share to, say, overall consumption or overall production. If you want to know how important burgers are to our lives, we can look at how much how much burgers are as a share of consumption, something like that. We can't do that for free digital services because we don't necessarily see say email as part of household consumption, and that makes it difficult to examine how much these things are impacting people's lives. In terms of the productivity puzzle, um, there's I assume that everyone is aware that there's been a slowdown in productivity for most of the developed world since the 2008 crisis. One of the hypotheses is that maybe we're not accounting for most of the output because they're not accounted for in GDP. So this is one of some of the broad motivation of this is some of the broad motivation for measuring these things. So why do we care? Primarily because we want to see how much we value how much households value these free digital goods and services, and perhaps we want to see the relative size of these goods and services compared to other things that we consume. Also, it gives us a sense of how much how vulnerable households are in terms of if they're shocks to these goods and services. For example, if WhatsApp or if WhatsApp or Gmail's if these companies decide not to provide these products for free anymore, by how much will households be affected? We can't necessarily see that in our measure of household consumption. So this is what some of the broad motivations of why we're interested in doing this. Can't we see aren't these goods and services already part of GDP as part of advertising, since many of these goods and services are financed by advertising? One of the problems we're aware that I'm aware that some of these goods are actually financed by advertising, and it should come into GDP somewhere, particularly as part of intermediate consumption. However, we don't necessarily see this in household final consumption as an item in itself. So if you're looking at how much value you derive from WhatsApp or Gmail or personal email, we cannot see that as a consumption good in the national accounts. So that kind of limits the ability of the national accounts to tell us how much these goods mean to us. Also, perhaps we can imagine that these digital goods and services generate value above advertising. One way I can think about this is during the pandemic, we can see that global advertising expenditure actually declined during the pandemic, even though our experience regarding the use of these goods and services is contrary to the decline in global advertising expenditures. Now, the goal of my research is to estimate the value of final consumption of free digital goods and of free digital products. The way we do this is to use a methodology that's already being used in the national accounts, which is the use of substitute goods, or the use of prices from related markets as a proxy for the value of these free digital goods. So for this paper, we focus on three forms of free digital products. So we're focusing on email, online news, and video conferencing. And we estimate the share of these products as a proportion to GDP and household final consumption expenditure. Now, just going through definition, when we talk about value, we're talking about the value of final consumption as defined in the national accounts. So we're looking at here, when we're thinking about value, we're looking at the demand side of we're focusing on the demand side of the national account as the value of final consumption that we derive from these goods and services. And whenever we talk about welfare in this context, we're limiting our characterization of welfare as consumption. So I understand that this is not a perfect measure of welfare, or this is not a perfect characterization of welfare. However, this allows us to maintain consistency with the national accounts. And when we're thinking about estimating prices, the way we're thinking about this is we're trying to get prices which reflects exchange value of these goods and services. The advantage of doing this things this way is that we want to maintain consistency with the national accounts. So in that way, we can compare all of our estimates to the aggregates being compiled by national accounts, such as other consumption items and GDP, household consumptions, etc., etc. This is also the principle behind many the non-market valuation in many non-market satellite accounts, such as the environmental satellite accounts, because they want to maintain consistency with the SNA in order to maintain comparability with other core aggregates in the system of national accounts. Now, this is not the first time that that people are doing this. I'm sure you're aware that there are a lot of papers trying to estimate the value of free digital services. So I like to categorize these efforts into two groups. There are other efforts, but I want to focus on these two. So we have contingent valuation approach, where where scholars are using surveys and experiments to get the willingness to accept as their metric for valuing the unit price of these free digital services. So some of the papers related to this is the BCDF paper, the GDPB, or the paper recently released by Yen and Coyle. What they're doing is they're asking individuals, how much are you willing to be paid to give up these goods and services? And the theoretical underpinnings for this efforts is outlined by Schreier in 2021. He's thinking the paper kind of thinks that what they're accounting for is actually own account production for own use by the household. The other set of studies, I like to call them the total cost approach, or the barter approach. So for this set of study, they characterize the provision of free digital services as a product of a barter transaction between digital service providers and household, wherein the households are selling their wherein the household are selling their viewership in exchange for access for free digital services. So here, what they're doing is that they're using the cost of the provision, or the total cost of the provision for these goods and services, mainly advertising expenditure or marketing expenditure, as a proxy for the value of these free digital services. What I like about the total cost approach is that it's consistent with the SNA framework. So using the cost of provision is actually one of the ways the SNA recommends how we can value non-market goods and services. I'm going to talk more about that later. Generally, their estimates should be consistent with the core accounting principles of the national accounts. One of the limitations of this approach, though, is that it's first, if the marginal cost of provision of these services is close to zero, perhaps it might limit the ability to reflect welfare to some extent. Also, many goods and services are not necessarily financed by advertising expenditure. They're usually financed through the freemium model. For instance, they're not being financed by advertising. They're offering free goods and services, just so with the hopes that even a small proportion of their users would go for the paid version, and that would finance the whole operation. For the contingent valuation approach, it's a good way to actually reflect welfare. You get the valuation for each individual. However, most of these approaches are using the willingness to accept the willingness to accept. It's probably a good starting point for valuing welfare in the context of free digital the free digital services, though it might introduce consistency with the SNA without some adjustment later on. And some literature in the environmental measurement strand have looked into this. So for the national accounts doesn't necessarily say that we cannot include non-market goods and services in the core in the SNA framework. And even in the core SNA, we have some non-market output incorporated in the SNA. So if you think about government services or services provided through owner-occupied dwellings, or for some countries like in the Philippines, we actually impute for the value of groundwater because just because of the volume of the use of these services. So we actually impute for the value of groundwater. And if you think about agricultural production for own use and barter transaction, these are some of the non-market goods actually incorporated in the core SNA. For satellite accounts, there are some satellite accounts that are intentionally tries to estimate the value of some non-market goods and services. So if you think about household satellite accounts or the ecosystem services satellite accounts, or to a certain extent the system of health accounts, they're trying to impute some form of non-market services. For the health accounts in particular, what they're trying to do is they're aside from the health expenditure being produced in the market, they're trying to include household production of health services as well. But how does the national account tackle the issue of valuation of non-market goods and services? The national accounts actually recommends the framework actually recommends two approaches: either use the cost of production of these goods and services, or to use the price of similar products. So some people call this approach a substitute approach, or maybe the replacement cost approach in other literature. So some of the examples of the use of these approaches, for example, for the cost of production approach, this is the approach being employed to estimate the value of government services and non-profit institutions serving households. For the price of similar the replacement cost or the use of substitutes, this is being employed to estimate the price of some goods and some goods, non-market goods in the SNA, particularly for us, it's groundwater, agricultural production for own use, barter transaction, and in some countries they use this to impute for the value of owner-occupied dwellings. Or yes. Now, for our particular purpose, what we choose is to use the price of the price of goods from similar products, or the replacement cost approach, or substitute approach, regardless, whatever you want to call it. So essentially, I'm going to be talking about this more later. So essentially, why we chose this approach is because if the way we think about this, if we just rely on just the cost of production, the cost of the provision of free digital goods and services, if the marginal cost is close to zero, we might not get a good handle on how big these goods and services, how big these goods and services are getting overall. So as I mentioned earlier, we're trying to measure the gross value of three forms of free digital services. So this is video conferencing, email, and online news. And I think I mentioned earlier that we're focusing on the demand side of the national account. So the way we're interpreting our estimate later on would be the final demand for these goods and services, which should fit into household consumption or final consumption expenditure. Now, the question is, what's the substitute, or what's the replace what's the substitute that we can use as a proxy for the value of free digital goods and services? So the way we answer this is, perhaps we can use the paid version of these goods and services. Some of these services are offered would have a free version, and some of them would have a paid version. So for the paid version, they might have they might have other they might have other services attached to what you pay for, and we're going to be talking about later on how we're going to treat that. But generally, the way we're thinking about this is that the paid version of Zoom would be a good substitute for the free version of Zoom. If we would be the good substitute for the free version of Zoom. Now, as I mentioned earlier, this approach is actually is something that is already being used in the national accounts. So this is just a paragraph from the SNA, which states that if the market is not available, we can use the price from similar markets as a proxy for the value of the non-market counterpart. Now, I mentioned before that when you pay for Zoom, when you pay for the paid version of or the premium version of a service with the free version, you're usually not just paying for the free version of that good. You're not usually paying. We're not for when you pay for Zoom, you're not just paying for video conferencing. You're also paying for the ability to record your call. You're also paying for breakout rooms. You're also paying for the ability to customize your domain. What we want to do is to adjust the price of premium services in such a way that we can remove the component, the value of the components that we can only find in the premium version, right? So how do we do this? So what we're trying to do is we're going to use hedonic regression to disentangle the price of the premium version, so that we can extract the value of that are exclusive to the premium version, and we just have the price of the free version. The free component. Once we have that, we're going to use that as our proxy for the shadow price of free digital services and multiply that to a volume measure. So the way hedonic regression works is that the way we can think about the price of a service is that it's a function of different characteristics. So for example, if we have the price of a good or of a service PI, we can say that price is the function of the different characteristics associated in that service. So if you think about the car, you're not just consuming a car, you're consuming horsepower, you're consuming mileage, things like that. And that's how we think about the characteristics of these goods in the Z term of the function. So how do we estimate the hedonic regression? So we can just estimate it using a linear regression, usually OLS. So we can express the log of the price, or maybe just the price, and we can express it as a function of the characteristics or the different attributes of these services. So for example, in our context, we can think of the price of paid Zoom as our dependent variable, and we can have all the characteristics that are exclusive to the premium version, to the premium version in our regression. So one way we can think about this is later on we can predict a price. We can use this regression to predict a price, and we can just switch off the components that are just present in the premium version. So what we're left is whatever that we can have. Whatever the value is for the free component. So this is our main specification. So we have the log of the price of free digital services. So for example, video conferencing, and we have fixed effects interacted with time, and we have a matrix containing all of the characteristics that we can that we find for the paid version of these goods. So later on, I'm going to show you how the data set might look like. So we try to maximize as much components as we can, because one of the problems with hedonic regression is that it's not very straightforward. One of the problems that people encounter is that it's susceptible to omitted variable bias. So we would want to include as much characteristics as we can in this regression. So anything that that would not cause multicollinearity, we try to include it in our regression. So one of the problems that later on, I'm going to talk to you about one of the problems that we encounter about measuring the price. So this is essentially how the data would look like once the data that we scrape would look like. So if, for example, if you're looking at one video conferencing service as say Zoho, it would have their website will tell you that the different characteristics the services will get, and it would have multiple prices. And for each price point, they would have different characteristics. For video conferencing, what we find is that there's a lot of variation in the price, depending on the number of participants that we can include in the call. So ideally, what we were thinking is that most of the characteristics would be binary variables, 1 or 0. What we can turn off when we're trying to predict the price, but we need to make assumptions later on the number of participants when we're trying to predict the price, because it can't have 0 participants even in a free video conferencing call. So this is what the data set would look like. So this is an example of the data set. Most of the characteristics in the regression would be binary variables. So it would indicate 1 whenever there's a presence of that characteristic or feature, and 0 otherwise. There would be some continuous variable. As I've shown you before, for video conferencing, the price varies a lot depending on the characteristics. The price varies a lot depending on the number of participants, and for email, it's the same for storage, etc. So as I mentioned before, the way we imputed for prices is just we just turned off all the we just set to 0 we just set to 0 the value of all the components that we shouldn't be able to find in the free version. However, we have some characteristics that we cannot set to 0. For example, the number of participants for the number of participants for WhatsApp, for video conferencing, and mail storage for email. So we have to make assumptions. What's the app for? So for free versions of these goods, how much participants can you have in say a free video conferencing call? So we looked at some of the top video conferencing services in the UK. So it's WhatsApp and Messenger. They have a maximum of 7 participants. We think that's a good assumption that we can use for in our prediction model. And for mail storage, for Gmail, and the 2 biggest email providers in the UK is Gmail and Hotmail. They provide 15 gigabytes of free storage. So we use that in our prediction model. So our panel data consists of information from 2017 to 2021, and we didn't just in order to get prices from the past, we use the Internet Archives, and to validate whether or not these services actually have don't have features that we don't know, we availed of the free trials for many of them. So these are the descriptive statistics. So In terms of the nominal price for video conferencing, we can see that the nominal price for video conferencing is increasing over time. However, if we normalize the price by the number of participants, we can see that the price per participant is actually decreasing over time. For email, we don't necessarily see a pattern in terms of prices. And for online news, we see that the price of online news is actually increasing over time. It's just, yeah. Now, here are our results. So we use our prediction model that I've shown you earlier to estimate the price. So this is the estimates of the price that we get. So generally, what we get for video conferencing is substantial. It's around less than 1.4 pounds. The largest value that we get, the largest price estimate that we get is for online news, followed by personal email. If we compare our results to some of the estimates for the estimates from the willingness to accept experiments, generally we find that our estimates are substantially lower than many of what they get from willingness to accept studies from these goods and services. Well, yeah, so it's generally smaller compared to willingness to accept experiments and surveys. How do we know that what we are getting is valid? So we make two assumptions. First, we assume that the majority of the value would be coming from the free component rather than the paid component, because when you're paying for email, you're not paying just to get just to change your domain name. We want to make sure that the value that you're paying would largely go to the email services rather than the premium exclusive component or the feature in addition to email. So we try to break down the components and see the share, and most of what you see is that the free component largely dominates the price that we get. We also want to know if our prediction model is satisfactory. So we predict the prices, even with the inclusion of the premium inclusive components, and we want to see whether our predicted prices would actually be in line with at least the average with at least the average of the observed prices. And what we see is it's fairly consistent with our predicted prices is fairly consistent with the observed price. So we perform a lot of robustness checks. We use forward, backward, and stepwise estimation. Maybe we're overfitting, and we see that our results are fairly consistent as well. All right, so that's for measuring prices. But what we're interested is actually the value or the gross value of free digital services. Once we have the prices, we multiply the price with our measure of volume. So what's our measure of volume? Since most of the prices that we get are subscription prices, so the way we think about this is perhaps we can use the measure of volume that is more similar to subscription prices or subscription. So how many people are actually engaged in this activity? So here, for this activity, we're using the Internet Access Survey for the ONS. This has been discontinued, if I understand correctly. I haven't updated it to the more recent years. Also, I have a problem with the Internet Access Survey with the ONS because for 2020, it was conducted before the lockdown. So the 2020 figures would not be reflected of, the behavior, the online behavior during the lockdown. So what we use as an alternative is that we use Ofcom data to augment just for 2020 to see they were able to record like how many people are engaged in activities like video conferencing, email, and online news as well. So this is our estimates. So our baseline estimates show that the gross value of free digital services would be around 3.2 billion to 11.1 billion. And it would for most years we don't see a substantial impact on household final consumption growth and GDP growth. It's only in the upper bound that we see some impact. However, during the pandemic, we see that the decline in household final consumption and GDP growth is actually impacted. Is actually impacted by the increase of with the addition of these free digital goods and services. Now here we're for this approach we're only counting we're only counting users once for every goods or service. So for instance, if you're using video conferencing, it doesn't matter whether you're using Telegram or WhatsApp or other video conferencing apps. You're only recorded once. But in reality, most people use multiple service providers. For example, I use Messenger, Telegram, and WhatsApp for video conferencing. So the utility that I get from these three might differ. So we tried to account for that by counting them people multiple times. And we're also thinking that, you know, we some people read online news from multiple sources. Well, hopefully people do. So when I read from one source, I read from another. So we want to try to account for these things because, you know, in the national accounts, if for market goods, if I'm subscribed to Netflix and I'm subscribed to Disney Plus, the value that I get from Disney Plus is separate from the value that I get from Netflix as accounted for the national account. So we want to be consistent with that. So what we try to do is that we use the number of active users as our volume measures. So this is our alternative measure of volume. So for online news, we use estimates from Ofcom regarding the percentage of people watching some of the top news sources. And using those as volume measures, we get estimates of around 7.77 billion to around 20.5 billion with a median estimate of around 13.3 billion. Comparing our estimates to other household final consumption products. So, you know, the good thing about these of our approach is that we try to we're trying to remain consistency with the national accounts. So I guess we can compare our estimates to other other final consumption goods recorded in household final consumption. So at least for the three digital services that we accounted for in this estimate, we find that the median value is around half of the value for the whole whole consumption of communication, around 25.4 billion to 7 billion to 25.4 billion. So with the maximum value at around 25.4 billion.
John, you have 5 more minutes.
All right. So I'm gonna wrap up. So so we also try to calculate the impact to GDP growth rates. So we try to see, you know, if we add this to GDP, how much would GDP change? So when we account for multiple service providers, we can see that we have an impact of around 0.7 percentage points to GDP growth rate, which is sort of in line with some of the estimates using the total cost approach when they use all advertising and marketing expenditures. So just a summary, the gross value for digital services as per our estimate would be around 7 billion to around 25.4 billion. This makes up around 0.3% to 1.1% of GDP, or 0.6% to 2% of household final consumption. The impact to GDP growth rate is around 0.3 to 0.12 percentage points. Now, some of the things that we're thinking about moving forward is to think about an accounting framework for all of this. So here, this tries to answer the valuation problem. How do we think about a methodology to estimate for the value? An equally important question, I think, is to think about an accounting framework for these things. So the way we interpret our estimates would is that they're part of final demand. They're part of household final consumption. Um, one way, another question would be, how do we think about gross value added? So how do we make adjustments in order to arrive at gross value added, and where do we assign income? So for the national accounts, whatever is consumed is produced somewhere and someone earned income from it. So where do we place that income? There are some people trying to answer that with the Barter approach and the Schreier framework. I'm working on this paper with two other co-authors when we're trying to develop a general accounting framework for these things, where we're thinking about inputs from viewership as an input in order to arrive at gross value added. And we're thinking about an expansion of a digital economy satellite accounts, which incorporates the value of these goods and services later on. And yeah, I'm working with Faith and Dean on this project. Another thing that we're thinking about is how do we think about network effects, because some of the value that we're probably trying to get is probably accounting for some of the network effects that are generated from these goods. So like Zoom is not just offering Zoom for free. They want people. They want the network for Zoom to be large, so that they can be palatable for premium users. So that has to factor in somewhere, and we're thinking about incorporating that in theoretical framework, and maybe think about how to work out the value of the network effects. Some of the things that we're thinking we're trying to do moving forward is also we want to expand this to other goods. So so here we can think about other digital services that have a paid counterpart, like storage or office tools, or maybe dating apps and online games. I have a separate paper on digital piracy. So the general principle applies, using the price of paid streaming as a value of free. So digital piracy is kind of like a free good, only just an illegal, acquired illegally. Now, the problem with my approach is that it's only confined to goods with paid versions. So how can we think about services that have no paid version? Like, for example, social media, streaming, some streaming services like YouTube, or search engines or online maps. I think this is in this area we can actually think about whether we can use like a contingent valuation to a certain extent, or the total cost with some adjustments. And that's something that that people might want to do, or might go in moving forward. And that's that for my presentation. So thank you so much for listening.
Thank you very much, John, and for that excellent presentation. Now, Carmit Schwartz will take over and give. Carmit, would you unmute and take it away?
Yes, thank you. And thank you, Leonard, and thank you, John, for your very interesting presentation. I'll just share the slides. And just let me know that you can see it properly.
Perfect.
Excellent. So thank you, John, for your very interesting presentation. And I would also like to thank ESCoE for the opportunity to discuss John's paper. My name is Karmit, and I'm a research associate at the Center for Applied Economic Research at UNSW Sydney. Our research center has been working on several projects concerning the digital economy, and John's paper fits well and complements our ongoing research on this topic. So I'll begin by placing the paper within the literature. As we saw, the aim of the paper is to derive the value of household consumption of free digital goods. Using hedonic techniques, it extracts the value, or you can call it the shadow price, of free digital goods from the prices of their paid premium versions. There are two main contributions that the paper makes to the literature. The first is that it offers a new approach to measuring the value of free digital goods. In this respect, it complements the two existing approaches, which are the total cost approach and the contingent valuation approach, as John discussed. The second contribution is that the paper expands the application of hedonic regression techniques. I'll just quickly recollect what has John presented in a short summary. So if focused on free digital goods, video conferencing, personal email, and online news. As the first stage, he imputed the shadow price of free digital goods using hedonic regression techniques. Once he got the shadow prices, he estimated the aggregate value derived by households from the consumption of free digital goods by multiplying the imputed prices by a volume measure. And in this context, it was taken as the number of subscribers. He then derived both current and constant price estimates of the gross value of free digital goods, and he repeated the analysis for three different data sources for the number of subscribers. Now, just in this context, I would like to note 4 key points. First, we see that for all 3 data sources, the gross value of free digital goods has grown substantially faster than both aggregate household consumption and GDP. And we see that the inclusion of the three free digital goods actually reduced the decline in both aggregate household consumption and GDP. The second point is that the estimated impact on GDP growth is closely to those obtained by other studies, both the ones that are based on the contingent valuation approach, notably by Brynjolfsson and his colleagues in their 2019 paper, and the ones based on the total cost approach, notably by Nakamura and Soloveichik and Nakamura and his colleagues in the 2015 and 17 papers. The third key point that I think we should take from the results is that while the impact of free digital goods on aggregate household consumption and GDP doesn't fully account for their observed decline, what we do see is a positive growth rate of digital goods uptake. And these are actually consistent with both our intuition and the changes that we actually observe around us due to the digital economy. And the last point that I wanted to note is that the results are sensitive to the number of subscribers. And this actually emphasizes the importance of obtaining accurate and reliable data on the number of subscribers. In terms of the paper's contribution, I can see 2 main contributions of the paper. The first is that it offers innovative use of existing ideas and techniques of hedonic regressions in the context of estimating shadow prices of free digital goods. In this respect, the paper expands the application of hedonic regression beyond quality-adjusted price indices and residential property price indices, and it builds up on previous work by Deroth in his 2003 paper, Triplet, De Haan and Deroth in their 2013 handbook, ESCoE and Grosjean. Now, the second contribution that the paper offers is that it develops a new technology consistent with the SNA framework to estimate the value derived by households from the consumption of free digital goods. And in this respect, the paper complements the existing methodologies. First, with respect to the total cost approach, again, notably the works by Soloveitchik and Nakamura in the 2015 papers, Nakamura and his colleagues in his 2017 paper, and Val Epps papers from 19 and 22. Now, the total cost approach covers the cases where the free digital goods are financed through advertising and marketing expenses, and it uses this expenditure to represent the value of households and that households derive from free digital goods. Now, John's paper complements this approach by accounting for different business models, that is, for cases where the free digital goods are financed through the paid or premium prices. I know that continued valuation based studies are problematic in terms of being consistent with the national accounts. Now, most of them concern the estimation of demand curves and consumer surplus, and they also focus on the possibility of incorporating welfare measures in the national accounts by expanding current definition of GDP. Now, I don't want to go into this to discuss this literature because it will take the discussion into a different direction. But I think that if we want to better evaluate the great contributions that actually John makes in his paper, I want to focus on one methodology which is based on continued valuation and is consistent with the system of the national accounts. And I refer to the work by Brynjolfsson and his colleagues, two of whom are my center director, Professor Kevin Fox, and a prominent member, Professor Erwin Dewart. Now, in their work, they address the problem of the introduction of new digital goods, of new free digital goods to the market, and they offer techniques on how to utilize continued valuations to derive reservation prices for free digital goods before they are introduced into the market. Now, while this work addresses the problem of new goods, it has one major limitation. It cannot be used to evaluate the impact of free digital goods on real household consumption from period to period. You can only compare any given period with the period before the good was introduced into the market. And John's paper complements this work by actually offering a methodology that estimates the impact of free digital goods on household consumption once they're introduced into the market and allows to make period-to-period comparisons. So if I had to classify the whole literature in this area, I would say that the reservation price helps us to address the problem of new free goods introduced into the market, and once the free goods are in the market, we can either use the total cost approach or John's approach, depending on the business model that fits the product. Now, reflecting on the paper, I can offer two possible extensions. Now, obviously, there are obvious extensions, as John discussed, expanding the number of products, obtaining more accurate data on the number of subscribers, etc. But what I would like to concentrate in my reflection is on two conceptual extensions. Now, I suggest it as outside the scope of the paper, and because the paper is already extensive, so these are just things that either John or other researchers may consider. Now, the first extension that I would like to offer is the development of theoretical model of the producer profit maximization or cost minimization to better understand the various considerations that producers have in setting free versions and premium prices of digital goods. Now, this can shed light on the relationship between the free and the premium components, and they might not be necessarily additive as John modeled in his paper. It is possible. I think it is possible to model using abstract functions with certain properties and then derive explicit formulas by specifying plausible functional forms. And this can, in turn, affect the hedonic regression modeling. The second extension that I would like to offer is to consider alternative volume measures and their implication on price deflators to obtain real gross value of free digital goods. Now, John in his paper offered two possible volume measures. He didn't discuss it in the presentation, but it does appear in the paper. The first is the number of times an individual accesses a specific digital product. And the second one is the full access itself to the digital product. So that's the subscription itself, which is independent of the actual use. Now, due to data limitation, it uses the second measure, that is the number of subscribers, and as the volume measure. Now, ignoring the data restrictions, from conceptual point of view, I think that in this context, another plausible volume measure could be the time spent using the digital product, and not necessarily the number of times that you actually access it. The choice of a volume measure is not just a data issue, and it affects the implied price deflators used to obtain real gross values of free digital goods. And this issue is actually closely related to the question of plausible treatment of excess charges in price indexes constructions. And this relates to works by Abdurrahman Coyle, Haynes, and Stewart in their 2020 and 2022 papers, and by Dewitt and Fox in their ESCoE discussion paper from 2023. Now, by assuming that the volume measure should be represented by the number of subscribers, we effectively assume that the quantity that household consumes in each period is fixed. So this is basically equals to 1. And in this case, the implied price index at the household level will only be affected by relative price changes, while the aggregate level of the implied price index will only be affected by changes in the number of subscribers. Now, if we use different volume measure, such as time spent on using a free digital product, then the price deflator at the household level will depend also on changes on time spent, and this in turn will feed into the price deflators at the aggregate level, which will be in addition to the changes in the number of subscribers. So, and I think this issue is important because, as was demonstrated by the excess charges literature, there are different possible treatments depending on the choice of a volume measure, and this should be taken into account in this context as well. And to conclude the discussion, I think that the measurement of the value derived by households from the consumption of free digital goods within the national guides is of great importance. Yet there are still obstacles to overcome. First, how to reconcile between the different methodologies. So different providers use different business models to finance the provision of free digital goods. While the total cost approach and John's paper offer treatment of two different business models, there still remains the question of how to reconcile them. Are they fully mutually exclusive in the sense that applying the two simultaneously will not create double counting in the national accounts? Would the application of both simultaneously will account for all possible cases? And then the second obstacle, as I see it, is accounting for the full complexity of digital products. And this brings the issue of bundles. So for example, as part of its Apple One subscription, Apple bundles offer access to almost all its services. That includes Apple Music, Apple TV, and iCloud storage. Google is about to offer a new all-in-one subscription, and this can include, for example, email account storage and YouTube Premium. Now, this is going to make the separation of different digital products and the hedonic estimation modeling quite tricky. And the further challenge that we see now in the market
one
is
more
that,
minute.
In the cases where, yeah, I'm about to finish, yeah. One more challenge that we see is bundles that combine both physical hardware and subscription fees. So this is going to be to require a bit of thinking how we should take this into consideration in the national account. So I will just end the discussion by offering a bird's eye view on how we should account for free digital goods in the national accounts. And in particular, I think that statistical agencies should take one step backwards and take full consideration of the different roles that free digital goods can play in the economy. As I see it, there are three different roles that free digital goods can play in the economy. The first is household consumption, and this is the focus of John's paper and the other studies that he mentioned in his presentation. The second role that free digital goods can play is as an input to economic production. So for example, Google Maps can be an input in production for taxi and Uber drivers, so in transport services. Most likely this will be in the form of capital input, and if this is going to be in the form of capital input, this requires a different treatment to the one used in the context of household consumption. The third role that we could see for of free digital goods is as a quality adjustment of other goods and services. For example, online banking can be as a quality adjustment of the provision of financial services, and again, this will require different treatment. So this completes my short discussion, and thank you for listening. And I also would like John for his very engaging paper, and I really enjoyed reading your paper.
Thank you, Carmit, for that very insightful discussion. Now we're going to take some questions from the Q&A. We're going to ask people asking the questions to unmute themselves and to give their questions verbally. The first person asking questions is Mikel Oliver Ver. Could you unmute yourself and give us the question? Thank you. Are you able to unmute yourself, Mikel?
Maybe we'll go back to Mikel after Paul's question.
Okay, so Paul, Eileen.
Hello, has that worked?
Yes, we can hear you.
Hi, thanks. Well, thanks very much, and thanks for the interesting talk. I just really wanted to ask whether these were really merely free digital goods, or are they at least partly in lieu of payment for the service provider's use of personal and transactional data? It seems to me that the services are provided by companies that are data companies as much as they are video conferencing or email or whatever companies. So perhaps this is a question which is directed in a sense to the further work and the that Carmit Schwartz pointed to at the end of feeding into this. But I think John also touched on it when he was thinking about moving just from the consumption side into fully integrating such data into the national accounts. Thank you.
Yes, so that's one of the things that we're considering when developing an accounting framework for these things, because for this exercise, where the main focus was to estimate the value received by households. But of course, the way we can think about things in the national accounts is that perhaps there's some input that households are actually providing as well, some sort of a barter transaction, like for if it's an advertising if it's an advertising finance business, you're selling your viewership. Perhaps one way you can think about this is selling your data, which can be an intermediate input of the household. So we can have, households producing their own account goods and services and having providing data as an input to that. So that's something that we're trying to work out in accounting framework, and it's so far I think it's a very thorny topic that we're still trying to get around in.
I can see that is complicated. Thank you. Yeah.
Mikel, are you able to unmute now? I suppose not. So we'll go on to Richard McRae. I see you're unmuted, Richard. Are you speaking? Please ask your question. Well, we seem to be having lots of problems here. Perhaps we'll go on to Bernard Goldhammer and try to come back to Richard and Mikkel.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, interesting, because I can't hear you anymore. But then at least I can pose my question, and then maybe you mute me again, and then it works. So my question is the following: I like a lot the economic analysis. So basically, it's a very good idea to value to put a value on those goods and services that do not have a price to the household by using hedonics from basically products that have a price. So that's very good for economic analysis. That's also good for giving a feeling how high the value of those goods and services is. However, I would not put them in international accounts, because there's already somebody who pays for it. Yes, these are the users of the premium version. It's like actually with first and second class on a train. So where the first class pays a far higher price, and to a certain extent subsidizes the second class, so price in second class can be lower. Here it's like somebody pays full price, other one pays nothing. The second is it's also intermediate consumption, because there's people that or companies that put advertisements on these platforms, and they pay for it. It's like with TV and radio stations, and there are also nobody is asking, oh, they are free to the households. Why don't we include that in national accounts? There's already somebody who pays for it. So I do not think that this has any effect on this, should have any effect on national accounts. Thank you.
To answer the question, I think the advocacy, I mean, what we're trying to advocate, well, in this paper, is not necessarily to replace the national accounts. I think that the national accounts at the current form answer certain policy questions that it's meant to answer. But what this exercise can contribute to is the development of complementary accounts if we want to see if we want to examine the value derived from these digital services. We look at these satellite accounts that accounts for these things. So one way we're thinking about this, I think I mentioned it towards the end, is that we're trying to think about expanding the digital economy satellite accounts that actually account for these actually account for these goods and service, the value household derived from these goods and services. So if we have a policy question that asks, so how much overall do households benefit from digital services, from the digital economy? We can look at the digital economy satellite accounts as a complementary table to the national accounts, not necessarily reflecting that replacing it as just as an answer to certain policy questions that the core national accounts couldn't answer in its current form.
Okay,
good answer.
I'm going to ask Mikkel's question that he put into the chat, since he doesn't seem to be able to unmute. His question is, given that the free component can be obtained for free, wouldn't it be right to think that the observed price for the premium version may be just the willingness to pay for the extra premium service, but not the free component?
That's actually one of the things that we were worried about in the beginning of this exercise, so that we wanted to test whether or not the willingness to pay for each of these components would dominate the price of the overall price of the premium component. And what we found is that when we sum up the price, the price of each of the premium, the components that we can only find in the premium version, it doesn't account for more than 30 to 40% of the overall price. So that at least that kind of indicates to us that maybe the residual will be coming from the main thing that you're paying for Zoom for, which is the main reason why you're using Zoom for, which is video conferencing, which you can also find in the free version. So that's how, at least that's how we interpret it. We interpret that result or that test that we did.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to ask Richard McRae's question. He says, hello and thanks. Is this work feeding into the updating of international manuals that is currently being worked on? For example, the balance of payments manual produced by the IMF.
I'm not sure. It will be nice if you can help with the updating of if you can contribute to the updating of the manuals, but so far not anything directly. I'm not working so far directly with international organization updating any of the manuals. Yeah, but would be nice to.
Yeah, as far as I'm aware, I'm a little bit in touch with the people who are writing the updates, and this information is too new to be in the current updates, but there's an international effort spearheaded by the UN to speed up the updating of the manuals, and this is going to be an ongoing process. So it's possible that this will feed into those conversations. All right, so I think that concludes our questions. We had some excellent questions, and after a very good discussion and presentation. So I think with that, we will conclude our webinar. Thank you very much to the presenters, and thank you very much for the questioners, and to the audience for attending.